On top of long-term changes, climate also varies on timescales of years to decades. For instance, warm and dry summers in Central Europe tend to occur in clusters, such as in the late 1940s or also around the year 1800. And the same is true for cold winters, such as around the year 2010 or in the early 1940s, or very prominently so in the late 17th and early 18th century. To better understand these variations, we need long records. Using tree rings and other climate indicators, scientists try to reconstruct past climate year by year. But the processes in the atmosphere underlying the warm summers and the cold winters occur on the timescale of days. High pressure systems, cold air outbreaks. And so to better understand these variations, we need day-to-day weather reconstructions. This requires a lot of data. From the 17th century onwards, some keen observers started to write down the weather every single day. And from the late 17th and early 18th century onwards, some of them started to use thermometers and barometers to make measurements. We now go back to archives in the framework of the Weather Reconstruction Project of the Swiss National Science Foundation. We try to find such records, digitize the data on them, correct, format, convert the data, and try to make them useful for science. We complement these data with month-by-month reconstructions and climate model simulations performed in the framework of the Paleo Reanalysis project of the European Research Council. We hope that in the end we will be able to reconstruct the weather day by day. One example of a historical weather diary is that of the Kirch family in Berlin. It all started with Gottfried Kirch, an astronomer from Leipzig. In 1677 he started his weather observations. In 1700 the family moved to Berlin, where Gottfried took on the directorship of the astronomical observatory. His wife, Maria Margareta Kirch, also a skilled astronomer, also led a weather diary of her own. On 18th of January 1701 she wrote into her diary: Der Himmel trübe, der Frost beständig, das Wetterglas hing in einer ziemlich offenen Kammer und war 16,5 Grad. The weather glass is 16.5 degrees. This refers to a thermometer and incidentally marks the beginning of the longest meteorological series from Germany. These historical weather data are very difficult to deal with nowadays. At that time there were no standards. How to place the instrument was up to the observer. There was not even a scale. This was before the time of Réaumur and Celsius and Fahrenheit. So each thermometer basically had its own scale. On the other hand, the record is very continuous. Gottfried Kirch observed until his death in 1710. His 30-year younger wife was not allowed to take on the successorship as a director of the observatory, but she continued the observations assisted by her son Christfried. And then later her daughter Christine, who was very much devoted to science, continued the observations. She did the measurements until the year 1774, so together this family diary covers almost 1 century of weather data. In the early 19th century, these data were processed and a monthly record of temperature for Berlin was made that goes back to 1701 and is nowadays widely used in science. However, the underlying measurements, the daily temperature data and all of the pressure measurements that they made have never been digitized. The Kirch diaries are today in Paris, the originals, but there are microfilms, and one copy of the microfilms has found its way back to Berlin, to the Free University of Berlin. In the 1970s, Xerox printouts were made of this microfilm, and last month, in March 2020, I traveled to Berlin to have a look at these printouts. I photographed all of them and returned with some 8,000 photographs of this Kirch diary. Now the task is to look at these data, to extract the weather information, to digitize the instrumental information, to process, convert, correct all of that information, and to make a long daily weather record for Berlin. And we will do the same with other records from Paris and from other places. And with all of these records, we hope that in the end we will be able to reconstruct the weather day by day for Central Europe, all the way back to the early 18th or maybe even the late 17th century. And having such daily weather information, we hope to be able to better understand these year by year and decade by decade variations of climate in Europe.